Recognize. Umbra Walker. D01. Recognize. The Caleb G. D02.
Hello, team. Welcome to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. I am everyone's favorite sidekick, Caleb, and those were my favorite boots. And allow me to introduce Rich, the true believer, here to find Dr. Fate, Howard.
Then Madame will make contact, if fate be kind.
But he so rarely is.
All right, welcome to episode 6. Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files. You can email us directly at whelmedpodcast@gmail.com. And of course, visit our website, crashingthemode.com. With that housekeeping out of the way, I think I'm going to turn it over to you here, Rich, for our first segment.
Hello, Megan.
This week's episode, we are talking about Denial. The episode release date was on February 18th, 2011. The in-episode date starts out on July 27th, which is a little bit after the previous episode, and then jumps to August 19th. So we get about 3 weeks worth of downtime. So the team's been training a bit, and we get a little bit of a glimpse of that as well. And then the director for this was Michael Chang, and the writer was Tom Pugsley.
Just in time for your next mission.
So that pre-credit scene I was talking about starts a few days after the previous episode. We see an older man walking through New Orleans. He's looking at a pocket watch that's got an old, faded photo of who we presume is his wife. He goes into a psychic shop, and we see Young Justice's version of Madame Xanadu, who is in DC Comics' powerful sorceress, and the younger sister of Morgan Le Fay and Vivian, who is the Lady of the Lake. She offers to connect this old man to his long-lost wife, Enza. She turns out to be a huckster, and the man calls her out on it. Clearly, this supposedly random man understands far more about real magic than she does. And then in the final moments, a very 70s-era deep-cut V-neck shirt villain teleports into the scene, kidnaps the man, and his walking stick floats into the air, glows, teleports away, and the woman we may have presumed to have been the protagonist of this episode as Madame Xanadu is shocked, and we cut out.
So the next scene kicks in about 23 days later. The team is in the cave hanging out, and they convince Red Tornado to let them help with a mission. Red Tornado tells them that he is worried about Kent Nelson. This is the man who was kidnapped. And Tornado reveals that this was Dr. Fate, the Golden Age Dr. Fate from the Justice Society. And he gives the team the key to the Tower of Fate, which is in, of course, Salem, Massachusetts. And they jump in the bioship to go investigate.
Yeah, and this episode is a running subplot, really, which is where the denial part comes from, which is a subplot that involves Wally. One of the things they've done with Wally is that he's kind of quite the techie, kind of riding on Barry Allen's forensic science background. In this subplot, Wally's kind of getting the seeds planted to learn to grow up. He doesn't believe that magic is anything more than super science and tricks, but pretends he's a believer so that he can get closer to McGann, who, along with Aqualad, have sorcery as a cultural touchstone, both in Atlantis and for McGann on Mars.
So McGann flies the bioship with the team to the coordinates of the Tower of Fate, but they just find an empty field. And we cut over to a nearby abandoned theater, and we see Abracadabra in his glorious 70s V-neck with a very creepy, strange little kid who is revealed to be Clarion, the witch boy. And they're torturing Kent, trying to get access to the tower. And they watch as the team, led by Calder, figuring out that they need to use the key to manifest the tower and then unlock the door.
Well, back in the subplot, the tower ends up rejecting the team because Wally lies to a spirit guardian who's protecting the tower and saying that he is a true believer, which triggers a back and forth between Wally and Artemis, who continues to try and call him out on his shenanigans because she knows that he's not a true believer. The team gets the tower to accept them finally when McGann tells the tower exactly why they really are there. They wander the tower's pocket dimensions until they come across the walking stick that we saw in the pre-credit scene. Wally and Artemis both grab the stick at the same time because they're both bullheaded, and it teleports them directly to Kent, Abracadabra, and Clarion, who managed to enter the tower after they did.
And then Kent explains to Wally and the team that Abracadabra is using futuristic technology to simulate magic, but Clarion is an actual Lord of Chaos. He is using real sorcery and magic here. This is also where we get the explanation about the Helmet of Fate, that it is in fact the vessel or the direct link to Naboo, one of the Lords of Order. And whoever puts on the helmet allows Naboo to manifest in the material plane, basically possessing their body for the time being, and that creates Dr. Fate. This is also where we hear a little bit about the affinity for magic in certain people, how it's greater in others and less in some.
Abracadabra and Clarion, just after this interaction between Kent and Artemis and Wally, managed to separate Kent and Wally from the rest of the team. Kent, Wally, and Clarion teleport to the top of the tower where the helmet resides. Kent is able to protect himself and Wally from Clarion with this big force wall, but it pretty much takes everything he's got and he dies. That's when things really start getting interesting. The walking stick is burning down like a candle, maintaining this wall as Clarion is letting loose on this wall to try to get to the helmet. It's a way to tell both the Watcher and Wally how long this wall will hold. McGann telepathically contacts Wally, tells him that they are losing badly and they need Dr. Fate, which is pushing Wally to question everything that he knows and what he should do.
So Wally, in this moment, has to decide whether to face Clarion with his own powers, his speed, or put on the helmet. He decides to take a leap of faith and put on the helmet. This is where we reveal really what makes Dr. Fate both really, really cool and horribly terrifying as a hero. He takes over Wally's body, starts fighting with Clarion, but inside we learn that your soul stops controlling your body. Naboo takes over. Wally has no connection to magic, no affinity for magic, so he is losing this fight with Clarion.
Yeah, that conversation, because Kent Nelson's spirit is in the helmet when Wally gets there too, so they get to have a conversation, and it's just beautifully animated and handled. But outside, when Wally/Naboo is getting his helmet handed to him, Naboo shifts his focus from Clarion to Teakle. Teakle is the cat familiar, or cat-looking, I should say, familiar that Clarion carries with him. Dr. Fate explains that Lords of Order and Chaos require anchors to manifest on the material plane, and for Naboo, it's the Helmet of Fate, and for Clarion, it's Teakle. So the fight ends when Clarion runs because Naboo shifts that combat focus into taking Teakle out. Naboo then, even though Clarion runs and Naboo wins the fight, quote-unquote, Naboo refuses to take the helmet off of Wally's body and leads to a really interesting conversation.
But then back inside the spirit realm of the helmet, Kent convinces Naboo to release Wally, offering to hang out as a spirit to keep Naboo company until a suitable host can be found, one with that magical affinity. Wally does keep the helmet as a souvenir, and he has a conversation with Artemis in the ending where he continues the disbelief in magic. He talks about how it was just technology doing what the magic was really doing.
Like rewriting his alpha waves or something, some techno-babble,
Yep.
right?
But there is a moment when he remembers Kent's final words, finding his own little Spitfire, one that won't let you get away with nothing.
Superboy, are you alright?
I'm fine. Feeling the Aster.
This is one of my favorite episodes, but for the content, not the actual events in the episode. I hate to say this, but this is kind of one of my low points. I don't dislike the episode whatsoever.
Yeah.
But just like you and episode 3.
Oh, sorry, everybody.
That's kind of how I feel about this episode. But ultimately, I still love it.
Nice. Interesting. Do you want to play on more of that? Or do you want me to dive into some of the stuff that I've got about the history of everything that's behind this episode?
Well, I can touch on it briefly, and then we can go into it.
Yeah, do that.
There was a lot of explanation in this episode. There was a lot of narration.
Oh, there's a lot of exposition. Yeah, I guess there was. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. We've been talking so much about how great Young Justice is at working facts into the plot. and in showing us what's going on, not just telling us things, I feel like this episode dips a little bit backwards into just telling us a lot of information. I think it just kind of messed up the pacing for me.
Interesting.
Now, what's really funny is I didn't develop this slight dislike for the episode until we really started analyzing the entire series as we've been planning this podcast.
I'm not sure how I feel about that.
It's all your fault.
Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
No. I like it though because this is challenging me to really analyze things I just love. The first couple times I watched this episode, I was thrilled by it. I love magic in the DC universe.
Mm-hmm.
I love Dr. Fate. I love the fact that this is eventually going to bleed into some Zatara and Zatanna connections.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Some of my absolute favorite characters ever.
I know.
So that just got me so excited. I just loved this episode. I loved seeing Dr. Fate slug it out with Clarion. But then as we've been really analyzing these episodes, I rewatched it, and I said, wow, they're just talking so much. Even Calder is just laying out facts about things that happen.
There is literally a conversation that takes place in an elevator, a la Mass Effect or whatnot.
Right.
I can kind of see where you're coming from on some of that.
And this is very much a villain of the week episode. I don't feel that there is as good a connection to the larger universe as other episodes.
I may counterpoint you on that. We'll see.
Oh, okay, that's fine. I feel like this is kind of a bottle episode. Almost literally, because they are trapped in the elevator.
Because they're trapped in it.
They're trapped in the pocket dimension.
We'll call it a Bell episode because the helmet looks like a bell. Yeah.
Also, there's no Robin.
And you know what? You know that I would normally just be saying, yeah. But I actually have a counterpoint to that as well.
This is great. I love bringing up this fun dynamic here. My complaints aside, I really do like this episode because of everything else that it builds into.
Even harking back to all the things that I said about Happy Harbor, there's a ton to love in that episode. It's just that, particularly after you've watched everything, it just doesn't shine as brightly. That's all.
Right. All right. So enough of me. Let's jump back to you here, Rich.
Yeah, enough of you. I've had enough of you already.
That's fine,
Mr. Negativity.
I'm just going to go get a new pair of boots. I'll be over here.
Go get a new pair of boots. I'm the true believer. This is where I started loving the episode. Pretty much right when it started. So the opening of this episode, it parallels the start of a number of Madame Xanadu stories. She was a cornerstone character in The Doorway to Nightmare, which was a 1970s DC horror comic. And in those comics, typically those stories started with somebody enters her store or discovers it or stumbles into her shop, and then something happens, right? They ask to talk to somebody or do something, and she helps them and blah, blah, blah. So for those of us who are fans and at least have some vague knowledge of what Doorway to Nightmare is, it was a bit of a bait and switch because we're like, oh man, this is going to be a Madame Xanadu protagonist moment. It wasn't until he said, "My beloved Enza," that I realized, oh no, that's Kent Nelson. Oh my. And then the fantastic line that we'll have at the beginning of this episode, I will contact her if fate be kind. And Kent's snarky comment of, but he so rarely is, also voiced by the absolute brilliance of Ed Asner. I don't know if I could love Ed Asner as a voice actor more. I think one of the first things I loved about Ed Asner, he did the voice of Granny Goodness in Justice League.
Also, Granny Goodness in Batman Superman Apocalypse.
Yep.
One of my absolute favorite DC animated movies.
Yeah. He's been a fantastic voice actor in the DC animated universe for a very long time. And I think I love his voice. I've loved him since his TV stuff way back in the day. But I have to tell you, when they got Ed Asner to do the voice of Granny Goodness on Justice League, I was like, I don't think I could love this man even more for stepping up and being, it's just saying, hey, I got pitched this part, Granny Goodness. Do you guys know what my voice sounds like? Is this really what you want me to do? Anyway, putting him in the guise of Kent Nelson was, I think, a stroke of genius. So anyway, I love that Kent really nods to Madame Xanadu having the perfect aura for the work. Because Madame Xanadu, as I mentioned earlier, is a powerful sorceress in the DC universe that's pretty underused for the most part, considering she's the younger sister of both the Lady of the Lake and Morgan Le Fay. In this, to see that she was a fake actually kind of put me off at first. I was like, whoa, that's not okay. But then he's like, oh, it's too bad. You've got the perfect aura. And I'm like, oh, great. Let's plant that seed and see what happens later, right? We don't end up seeing Madame Xanadu later on in the series, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't see her in a season 3. I'm also okay with stuff like this once in a while, that it doesn't plant a seed because it gives it a feel of a bigger universe. And I think that's my comment about Robin. I want Robin in every episode. But here's the thing. It's important to know when not to do things. And Robin wasn't needed in this episode, for one. He wasn't needed in this episode. The focus was going to be on Wally and the more mystic characters and Artemis, who is counterpointing Wally. You get the characters who need to be there to do the thing that you need to do. That's fine. In addition to that, we do find out what happens. Wally says Robin is with Batman doing the dynamic duo thing, and we get the comic books. So I don't think we brought this up very much in the last few episodes, but the comic books that came out that are tied to the series aren't just little one-shot little thingies that don't have anything to do with anything. They're literally tied into the show. So we get to see on the timestamp of them going on this adventure what Batman and Robin were doing at that point in the comics. So now we've got this bigger universe again. Also, we get that feeling that Robin's Robin. He doesn't 24/7 isn't the team for him. He's got school. He does go to Gotham Academy. He's a student. He does the Batman Robin thing in the evenings and the weekends or whatever. So seeing some of these characters cycle out actually in this particular case makes it feel like a bigger universe to me. So that's my counterpoint to your point.
That is a great point, and I'm a little bit ashamed that I didn't consider that.
Yeah, you should be.
I am.
I'm here to shame you.
That's fine. I accept my punishment, Rich.
No, not at all, man. Because I was like, what? No, Robin? Come on, guys. More Robin. But then I didn't know the comics were coming out and everything else afterwards. This is a bit of a retrospect for me. Yeah.
On a personal level, I really liked the fact that Kent debunked the sham of the seance. I love that part of history when Houdini was debunking psychics and mystics. That entire chunk of time I'm personally very fascinated with.
That's interesting.
Still to this day, skeptics debunking psychics and people that are scam artists, that kind of thing. I love that. I'm completely fascinated by it.
You could totally see a subplot where Zatara is doing that.
I absolutely could. I would love that.
Yeah, that would be really, really interesting.
So that was just a very personal moment to me that I really enjoyed.
Yeah. In that same vein, there's the scene where Artemis and Wally are in the elevator. And Wally's this whole time been like, magic is bonkers, it's super science, it's ridiculous, these guys are all scam artists. And so when Kent says, oh, there's massive, magical power, and Wally's like, abracadabra? Seriously? No, Flash proved that guy uses futuristic technology. And Fate's like, oh no, abracadabra's a doofus, or whatever he says. I can't remember. He's a charlatan. I think he does a nicer word. And Artemis is actually surprised that Wally's right. He's like, wait, what? And he's like, yeah, abracadabra's forget that guy. I'm talking about Clarion. That guy's going to destroy the world. And then, you get that kind of feeling where Kent really clearly grasps. They use this charlatan and abracadabra of all D-string villains to kind of point out that, yes, sometimes it is super science masquerading as sorcery, but we're talking about something completely different. And it was a nice counterpoint for me.
I also really like that within the context of this fictional universe, both super science and magic are legitimate sources to do the same thing.
Career paths.
Legitimate career paths, yeah. And even though this episode had a whole lot of Wally being Wally, he wasn't wrong. And that's what I really do like about it.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't the scapegoat in this episode.
Mm-hmm.
He's a smart kid, but he's also a 15-year-old kid. And Kent calls him out on it. He's like, how did you get so bullheaded in just 15 years? Let it go. You live in a universe in which there are aliens and Green Lantern Corps, and why is magic boggling your mind? Yet you do kind of grasp what that is, because Wally can say, like, yeah, but Superman's powers have an explanation. The Green Lantern rings are technology. We get how that works. You can see it, and I'm glad that they continue to build him as being a smart guy who makes different choices than other people do. Anyway, there's some other stuff in here. Calling back to the Ed Asner with the voice acting. Again, with the little subtle things. I don't know if it's just language, like when they do actual non-English languages to get the real feel and put subtitles. It helps with that verisimilitude and grounding this incredibly ridiculous, fantastical story we're watching. But the same thing happened, like this little detail of the fact that Kevin Michael Richardson doing the voice of Naboo with his cool, deep, booming voice. And we'll talk more about this in Crashing the Mode, but when you get Wally and Naboo talking at the same time, and they're doing the same lines, and they're overwriting the same lines, so you get this feel of like this power of Naboo, but he's literally speaking through Wally's voice box. So you get that mix of the power and Wally's voice. It's a subtle thing to do that takes extra editing and takes extra voice work in the booth. And most people, I guess, they don't really think about that. When you have to think about what you're going to do and plan these things ahead of time when you put it in an animated series like that. I love it. I love Kevin Michael Richardson as a voice actor anyway. That overlay, oh my gosh, I don't even know. I'm out of words.
Kevin Michael Richardson has done a lot of great voice work. He also is the Joker in The Batman, one of the more recent animated series.
Oh, yeah, right.
So he gets some great time to shine there. I really do love the double voice work. Like you said, that's really cool. When we cut to the scenes inside the helmet,
yeah,
very, very subtly, we also were hearing the action outside echoed into this little spirit dimension.
Yeah.
And it's not something you catch right away because you're also hearing the echo of
Kent and Wally talking. Yeah.
Yeah, you're hearing them echoing out in this infinite expanse, but we also hear the action of Clarion and Naboo fighting.
And that transition, too, was so cool because we see Wally put the helmet on just as Clarion hits him with this horrifying blast, right? But then it cuts to Wally inside the helmet, and it's perfectly quiet and calm. It was just this great way of demonstrating, of taking that emotional roller coaster ride with the character. Let's see what Wally's perspective is. What is the most jarring thing that we can see? The most jarring thing that we can see is the disturbing fact that Wally is now in a place that he doesn't understand. That's kind of weird. What happened to all the action? And then to cut back to the fact that there's a fight that's been going on for the last 2 minutes that you've been talking to Kent Nelson that is going to kill you. But you don't sense or understand any of it. But you can learn to watch it and deal with it. But that's it. And that is where we really get that emotional roller coaster ride of, wow, Dr. Fate is actually really messed up. He's not a Lord of Good. He's a Lord of Order. And then in relationship to like role-playing games, if you're talking about like a Dungeons and Dragons, alignment chart thing, lawful doesn't always mean good, and chaos doesn't always mean evil. He's lawful neutral at best. I'd say Clarion's probably chaotic neutral as well. Because you never know what he's going to do from moment to moment, but it's not about good and evil with them, which makes it like, whew, is Dr. Fate really a hero? Or are we just hoping we aim him in the right direction, right?
Well, he even brings that up a little bit. Some of his quotes were, the Earth needs a Lord of Order.
Right.
Not good, not evil, order.
Thank you, Darth Vader.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I actually just finished a series of articles about alignment over on the RPG Academy. And I think what was most interesting for me as I was writing these articles was that it's not a black and white. There's all these variations, there's all these gray areas between good and evil, and Young Justice does a really good job at exploring these moralities of consequences of choices. So Wally didn't know what was going to happen. He made a leap of faith. I have to do something. The candle's burning, the walking stick is about to disappear. What am I going to do? My team's gone. I have no idea what's happening.
Yeah, when Miss Martian, who in later episodes we have villains going like, yep, the Martian's back, everybody leave. She's going to kick our butts, right? To have Miss Martian climb into his head and say, Wally, we need Dr. Fate right now. Like, Superboy's down, like, we're in trouble. You feel Wally's perspective. Although we get a bit of an ensemble, a nod to a lot of different characters, and I'll get into some of that a little bit more in a minute. It's really a Wally POV episode, for the most part. He's really our character arc person. You can argue that Artemis may be as well, but I think she's just really the counterpoint. She's the foil to Wally in this.
And that's one of the reasons I think this episode works so well, because at this point, Wally's Wally. The goofy, I'm going to mouth off, I'm going to run my mouth, because that's all I do.
Yep.
And now we suddenly see that not only is he a very smart person,
right?
He's grounded in who he is as a person,
right,
and where his power comes from.
Yep.
But we're getting this really huge decision for him.
Yeah.
That scene where he is picking up the helmet and sliding it on, that's one of those moments where the animation in Young Justice shines so beautifully.
Yeah.
Because there's that hesitation.
Yeah.
What am I doing?
That moment, the helmet's like hovering over his head and you see him like, and then he puts then he slides the helmet on right as Clarion would have killed him. Yeah, pretty amazing stuff. And one could say that at the end of the episode, Wally dismisses all of the quote-unquote teachable moments of the episode. But later on, you start to understand, at the bigger picture of the entire series, he didn't. When I watch the episode, I see Wally at the very end trying to go back to what he was and not doing it very well. That's all I know. I'm going to go back to doing this thing. But he can't let it go. And as the season goes on, it feels like these are one of many seeds that come up. So you see Wally in like Cold Hearted, which is a very Wally focused episode. And then you see him in Bereft, where they've lost their memories. And you see him building these bits and pieces of himself as things move forward in the series. By the time we get to the end of the first season, his view of the world and his friends and specific individuals in the team changes. Then we get the jump to season 2. And we don't see Wally at the beginning of the season. We don't know where Wally is or what's happening. And then we find out what's going on with him. And it's subtle. He's not in a ton of the season in season 2, but it's so good. Again, with the character growth of all of these characters. And this is, I think, one of those first seeds of Wally breaking himself down and opening himself up.
This is absolutely where we see Wally start to develop as more than just a smart aleck speedster.
Right. Other things, too. So there are other characters who get nodded to in this episode, too. It's the first time we get the seed planted of Atlantean and Martian physiology not doing well in heat. So for those who don't know, Martian Manhunter was basically Superman plus. His powers over the years, the decades in the DC universe have varied so much that he's basically Superman. If Superman had shape-changing, density-shifting, telepathic, mind-controlling powers. Oh, he doesn't have a kryptonite. Okay, he's a pyrophobe. Like, he doesn't do well in heat. Fire is bad. Right? And you're like, what is happening with this character? He's since kind of been settled down a little bit, so he doesn't have all of the powers of Superman plus. And he kind of has his own niche, which is good for modern storytelling techniques. But they reflect that with Miss Martian, and they do it really well in a subtle way. Like, it comes up. But like you're saying, it's a showing, not telling, typically. In this case, Calder has to say, like, our physiology doesn't do well here, guys, then to inform the team and us. We can see it, but he needs to make it clear to them so they can change something. And then later on, they don't really make reference to it again. There's several episodes in which Miss Martian, we just know that that's one of her weaknesses, and it comes up again in future episodes. But also when there's some conflict with Martian Manhunter, it comes up again in the future as well, in a really disturbing way, actually. Then the last thing that I want to talk about is something that we're just going to nod to, and then we're going to talk to in Crashing the Mode, which is that last line of Kent Nelson. Find your own little Spitfire, one that won't let you get away with nothing. And when Ed Asner's giving you that kind of advice in that voice, man, it's hard to not hear it echoing around in your head. But let's save that for the Crash in the Mode, because that's definitely got some spoilery stuff in it. And maybe move on to the Canary Debrief.
Well, there's one thing I want to bring up here to wrap up. I love the fact that in the beginning, when they're back in the cave and they're training, Superboy is much more in control of himself.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a very brief little scene where he and Calder are sparring, and he's not the rage-fueled monster that he was before. he's fighting tactically.
Yep.
And he actually beats Calder and says, that's a Black Canary taught me that move.
Right, he beats him with a technique and not just strengthening his way through whatever's happening. Right. And it's been over 3 weeks, so we see that they've all gone through some more training with Black Canary. I agree with you. I think it's a great scene. And you can see the smile on Superboy's face, which also plants some seeds for him that he's starting to open up and change. Actually, I forgot there was one thing I wanted to address. You were talking about it feeling like a Villain of the Week episode. Clarion is capstone to the plot for the whole season. So I kind of can see what you're saying. But this episode sets up so much stuff for the future that we can talk about in Crashing the Mode that I think that I'm okay with it. I wouldn't say that this is my favorite episode. No, I wouldn't say that it ranks down with Happy Harbor, though. Of course, the space between Happy Harbor and my favorite episode is pretty narrow just because everything's so amazing.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we need to know who Clarion is and what he does and what his weaknesses are and how powerful he is and all of that kind of stuff for the future. So if it was somebody that ended up being a throwaway like Mr. Twister, I might agree with you, but I don't agree with you on that front. That's my counterpoint.
That's fair. That's absolutely right. I definitely agree with you about this episode serving to introduce many, many larger aspects that we see going forward. Let's dive real quick into our Canary Debrief.
Stick around. Class is in session.
We've already touched on a lot of these points.
We did, yeah. In the Canary Debrief, of course, we talk about storytelling in general, what you can do in your role-playing games, novels, etc., etc. There's a basic tenet of storytelling writing, which is you introduce something 3 times before a reader is going to file it away. If you introduce that there's a magical sword in your universe in the first couple chapters of your novel, make reference to it again sometime mid-novel, either a big or small nod to it. And then when it comes up at the end, it doesn't feel like a Deus Ex Machina. When the reader forgets something that you told them, that's fine. When you mention something at the very, very beginning and then don't say anything about it ever again until the very end, you might get away with that. If that sword ends up being at the end and you've never said anything about it before the whole time, then that's a problem. So this episode introduces some things that are critical for later on in this particular season and into next season as well, which is Clarion, who's cornerstone to a lot of what's going on with the light, the helmet of fate, which comes back again and again, and we'll talk about that in a minute, and planting seeds for that character growth, including planting seeds for a character growth, one of my favorite and most painful character growth moments of the entire series, for a character who hasn't even been introduced yet. This is plotting and planning and thinking about where we can take the story. And if we're going to introduce element A, how is it going to affect elements B, C, D, all the way to Z? How do we make this all wrap together? How does the Helmet of Fate affect Superboy? How does it affect Robin? Does it need to? It definitely affects Wally. It definitely affects other mystical characters, the fact that this exists, and they have it on their shelf in a library in their house. It comes up again and again. If you have access to that kind of power and you don't make a nod to it in episodes in which you are losing badly, like somebody saying, do we need to put this helmet on? Then the watcher is going to be like, why don't you just put the helmet on? But, they talk about it and they make reference to it again and again, even when it's not a main part of the episode. This is that introducing things a few times before you get whatever punch, whatever that item is toward the end. So if you have something like that in your story, check it early. Don't introduce it right at the end. Make sure you're doing the editing and the thought process and digging a little deeper. I have way more to say on this, but we're going to have to tuck that into Crashing the Mode.
Well, let's just jump right into it then with Crashing the Mode. We are going to be talking about spoilers for the DC Universe and specifically what happens in later episodes of Young Justice. If you do not want to have anything spoiled, stop listening and come back later.
Tell us something we don't know yet.
Sorry, BB. We can't risk altering the time stream. We do that, we're all feeling the mode.
All right, great. Let's crash this mode. Justice Society. Justice Society. I love Justice Society.
And this is something that I think is a really cool inclusion for viewers like you, Rich, who have that history with DC Comics.
Justice Society is great. And I talked about this a little bit during the Robin Secret Origins episode. The fact that these original characters that we're talking about, so the Jay Garrick Flash, the Alan Scott Green Lantern, these characters were introduced back in the 40s and 50s. And then in the mid to late 50s, DC rebooted everything. They wanted to modernize their characters. And so the Flash, DC's Flash, got rebooted to this Barry Allen modern forensic scientist guy, as opposed to Jay Garrick, who wears a World War I helmet. They were separate characters. It's like, oh, that Jay Garrick guy doesn't exist anymore. We're just going to do this thing. And then they kind of started buying other smaller comic companies that owned characters like Captain Marvel and The Guardian and all of these characters that we see in the series, but also in DC Comics in general. A lot of these came from other smaller comic companies that had created them and that DC had bought the properties for. And so they started creating these multiple Earths. So there was Earth 1, which is their main Earth. Earth 2 was the Justice Society Earth. So there's no Justice League. There's this Justice Society instead. There was Earth S, which is the Shazam or Captain Marvel Earth that had its own thing. So and then they mashed those things together in the 80s with Crisis on Infinite Earths and had to kind of retcon and fold everything together. And what they did at that point was just say like, oh no, Jay Garrick existed. And he was the first Flash. And then there was Barry Allen. And then there was Wally West. And then there was. Right. The Alan Scott Green Lantern is a Green Lantern. And, you know, the idea, depending on which history you read, is that a Green Lantern Corps member with this tech ring had landed on Earth and a magician had seen the ring work and tried to duplicate that with magic and then created the magical lantern, and then that led to Alan Scott becoming that version of Green Lantern. So Justice Society is now seen as a precursor to the Justice League. The Justice League was inspired by these previous heroes from a bygone age. Now, here's the thing. Red Tornado was a member of the Justice Society. Dr. Fate, the Spectre, Sandman, a character called the Atom, Wildcat, who we've seen in Justice League Unlimited. All of these characters existed, and to see them, and we get in the future episodes, particularly with Tio Morrow, we see these flashback photos. Red Tornado was originally created by Tio Morrow to infiltrate the Justice Society, not the Justice League, the Justice Society, and undermine it. But they folded in Red Torpedo and they folded in Firebrand in this whole kind of dynamic and universe, which I think is really interesting. So it gives some depth, it gives some history to the universe. We don't need to know much about the Justice Society, but the fact that it even exists makes us want to know more. And I love it. Also, it makes us wonder, like, wait a minute, this was back in the World War II. Why is Tio Morrow not older? And we get that later on and find out that Tio Morrow is older, and the Tio Morrow we're seeing is an android. But at first it felt like, I was like, this is weird. This is a weird jump. Like, they made a mistake. They didn't make a mistake. They did exactly what they wanted to do. As our friend Darcy says, all of the emotions you're feeling in the early episodes is exactly the way they want you to feel about a character. If you weren't sure about Miss Martian because she's kind of the ditzy sitcom parallel, that's because they designed her that way for a very specific reason, and you will know why later. In this case, it's the same thing. I love it.
I absolutely agree. Some of the other things we can crash here, the dynamic between Artemis and Wally.
Yep.
This is where we see the beginning of their eventual relationship. This is a long payoff, but what's really cool here is that the show is building their relationship organically.
Yeah.
We are seeing these two people who flat out do not like each other.
Yeah.
In that kind of way. They do not have a romantic relationship when they first meet. It's not something that just gets thrust upon us later on. We see this dynamic of them snapping at each other, and Artemis just constantly mocking Wally, calling him on his shenanigans.
Yeah, again, that episode where they're in Bialya, bereft, we get to see this little layer. Oh, look, there is a physical attraction between the two of them because they don't remember anything about their previous interactions. So there is an underlying something that could happen there. That's interesting. And at first you're like laughing at it because it's so counterpoint to what we've seen. But then you also realize in the long term that it's yet another seed of their relationship together, which pays off so painfully and wonderfully in season 2.
And, of course, since we have mentioned many times Kent Nelson's final line to Wally about a little Spitfire.
Yeah.
That Spitfire is Artemis.
Yep.
If it wasn't completely obvious.
If it wasn't obvious, yeah. But I mean, again, the first time watching the show, you're like, okay, I guess he's kind of, but are they really going to do that? You're still in a mindset of watching what would normally be a normal animated show, which is, they may or may not do something about it. I don't know. But these writers, of course, are planning everything ahead. So it's fantastic. And seeing that Wally's character growth into season 2, where he just feels so grown up. He's in college. He's responsible. He genuinely loves Artemis and vice versa. And they just have just a really good relationship. I don't know. We don't see him very much, but what you see, you believe. And I love that.
Mhm.
I love it. And it's a growth moment for Artemis as well, because when, the first episode we see Artemis in, she's really still in this abused mindset from her family situation, which was freaking terrible. It sucked. And, we see her grow up as well and get her feet under her for her own life. And I love that.
And I think the last thing we should touch on briefly here in Crashing the Mode is, of course, Fate and the helmet of Fate. With ending up as a souvenir on Wally's shelf, it's very obvious that this will come back later, and it very much does. This comes up multiple times.
I expected it to come back maybe once. I didn't expect it to come back as many times as it did, and in such a good way. And different people put the helmet on, right? So Calder puts the helmet on, and I'm like, oh crap, he's exactly who you want in that helmet, right? Trained in sorcery, physically strong, durable, the whole deal. I didn't think Naboo was going to let him go. We can talk about this more in that episode, I guess. Definitely there was Kent Nelson was present and saying, no, this isn't the right one either. You need somebody older, more experienced. Mm-hmm. Somebody, whatever he did. So that I was okay with that. But then we get to the end, man, and the final gut punch of who ends up with the helmet and that whole dynamic. Man, as a father to a daughter, that whole dynamic just makes me tear up every single time I watch it.
And I do not always experience the same emotions that you do when watching this show, Rich, but I definitely had some feels in that eventual moment. We will definitely get to that when it happens.
Yeah, we'll crash that mode when it comes and talk about that, because that deserves some time.
Absolutely.
I do want to talk a little bit about the history of the Helmet of Fate, because it does really pass from person to person in the DC universe again and again. Kent Nelson was the first person, and then it passed to his wife Inza, and then there was a time in which Kent and Inza Nelson merged together and become Fate, and then Eric and Linda Strauss, they got the helmet, and Jared Stevens, who is then the reincarnated Hector Hall, who's this complicated son of previous Justice Society members, and then Kent V. Nelson, who is Kent's grandnephew. There's versions from various parallel Earths as well. So Khalid Ben Hassan, who is a colleague of Kendra Saunders, who people will know if they watch Legends of Tomorrow, the live action show, as the current Hawk Girl. There's a medical student, Khalid Nassour. There's so many others from both on Earth and parallel dimensions as well. Whoever wears the helmet gets the powers of Naboo and the powers of Fate. So it is nice to see it paralleled here in the Young Justice universe. Again, it's one of those things that just makes the universe a little bit deeper and keeps the heart of the character alive. I've never seen Dr. Fate as being as terrifying as I see him in Young Justice. And it's where, again, I see the writers saying, like, what would happen if this was a thing? If you put a helmet on and your soul gets rewritten and you are literally mind controlled by an ancient power. Not comfortable in any way. Like, first, why would it ever let you go? And second, why would you ever put it on? So they really take the time to dive a little deeper into that psychological nightmare fuel.
All right. Well, I think we can consider the mode successfully crashed here for this episode. Let's jump over to fan service. Rich, you've got something very cool to share with us at this point.
Yeah. So as we are not shy about, you know that Caleb and I are both big gamers, role-playing game fans and contributors. This week, our fan service goes out to Steve Kenson. Steve Kenson is a designer for Green Ronin Publishing. Designed Mutants and Masterminds, which is a superhero role-playing game based on the D20 system rules, for those of you who are familiar with that. He also did True 20 adventure role-playing as well. He's written for Pathfinder. He has his own company as well. Great stuff. Steve Kenson wrote two of my all-time favorite third edition third-party publishing supplements as well, the Psychic's Handbook and the Shaman's Handbook, which were a brilliant balance of crunch and fluff. And I use them and mod them myself constantly. Well, it turns out Steve, not surprisingly, being a Mutants and Masterminds writer, is a fan of Young Justice. So he has a blog that takes a look at episodes from Young Justice from a tabletop role-playing game perspective, both in terms of game design and gameplay. It also just happens to be that he has reviewed all the episodes that we've talked about up to this point. If you love Young Justice and you play games, role-playing games, or even write stories, I can't recommend this enough. He's absolutely one of my favorite designers, and his love of superheroes, gaming, and Young Justice is very clear. You can look up Steve Kenson. He had his website, stevekenson.com. I just spoke with Steve yesterday, and he's agreed to come on the show. So he is going to come on one of our bonus episodes, and we'll be chatting about role-playing games and superheroes and Young Justice.
Wonderful. Well, that is another bonus episode to look forward to. Of course, check out Steve Kenson's stuff now. His website is both in the show notes and on our website, crashingthemode.com, under resources. If you have anything you are working on that is related to Young Justice, fan art, blogs, gaming stuff, projects, get in touch with us so we can feature you here in our fan service. You can contact us through the website, through email, through Twitter. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate your time. Rich, I think it's time to wrap up and head out of the cave.
Remember, everybody, hashtag keep binging YJ on Netflix, and stay whelmed.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our computer is voiced by Madison Ray. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.